cake. Something that, especially if you manage to stumble across this little channel, you're probably somewhat passionate about, whether it's lusting after it, shopping for it, eating it, or perhaps even making it. Maybe you've even dreamed of being a pastry chef yourself one day. If so, you're in fabulous company. Last year, I was gifted this book called Pastry School, which was written by the world's most famous culinary institute, the Cordon Bleu. Since then, I've been undertaking a little series of videos on this here channel, teaching myself to be a pastry chef from the comfort of my own flat in northeast Scotland, the home of all good pastry chefs. So far in the series, we have tackled all things chocolate, all things biscuit, all things creme. We've learned new skills, new techniques, and battled the most nightmarish of recipes. Today's episode is about all things cake, from the simple, beautiful, and basic to the overly, unnecessarily intricate. It's going to be fun, it's going to be frustrating. Let's get into it. The pound cake, a classic in so many different countries, often just with a slightly different name. They can be known as loaf cakes, as butter cakes, as financiers, as pound cakes. In French, my favourite, Gateau de voyage, as in travel cake. These are basically simple, sturdy, but soft and lovely sponge cakes that can be flavoured with just about anything. Today's recipe is going to be for a lemon pound cake that they wanted to make into like 3 weirdly and annoyingly small loaf cakes, but I actually just made it into 1 large loaf cake instead. We began this recipe by breaking eggs into a large bowl, adding lemon zest and sugar, whisking and whisking and whisking until it turned pale and thick. We then added flour, baking powder, and a good old generous blob of melted butter, whisking it until we had a kind of smooth cake batter, adding it to our prepared single bigger loaf tin, and baking it for about half an hour. For a cake like this, you don't need any kind of fancy frosting, you don't need anything crazy, just some icing sugar and some lemon juice stirred together and poured over the cake while it's still warm so that it forms this beautiful kind of crust almost. I actually took this recipe to my parents' house, so I didn't get a kind of shot of me tasting it for you, but this is an absolute staple. It's something I've made many times before in slightly different variations, and it always goes down well. Imagine that lemon loaf from Starbucks. That's kind of what you've got going with this cake. Big fan, and this will always be a kitchen staple. Marble cake is today's bake. Le Cordon Bleu annoyingly wanted us to make 3 sort of medium-sized loaves of this cake, and instead of doing 1 bigger size like I did with the lemon one on the same day, I decided to make 12 kind of wee ones instead, which in my opinion was a great idea. Marble cakes, much like pound cakes, as seen previously, can come in a variety of different kind of flavours, but the most commonly seen are a blend of vanilla and chocolate or vanilla and coffee, in which you essentially have 2 identical cake mixes, one just with a slightly different flavour stirred through, marbled, surprisingly, together and baked into 1 tin so that you have a nice blend of flavours while still keeping things fairly simple. For this recipe, we started by preparing our little tin. I used a little kind of financier tin, which is like an individual, almost brownish shaped looking thing. And we start by beating together our butter and sugar, as in a standard British or American cake style. We then add our eggs, add some vanilla, add some flour and baking powder, then split 1/3 of the batter into a separate bowl. To that bowl, we add a combination of cocoa powder and milk to make a chocolate batter. We pour the vanilla batter into our prepared tins, then kind of dawd over our cocoa batter and use a fork, the tip of a knife or a cocktail stick just to marble these lovely little creations together. In hindsight, my marbling could have been more effective as mine ended up a bit more two-tone than perfectly marbled, but essentially you then bake these until they're nice and firm and risen, and you have some lovely individual tea time treats or little breakfasty snacks with a coffee. Again, nice and simple, much like many cake recipes across the globe. This is a good one to have in your back pocket, but definitely the last of the simple ones in this chapter. Folks, today we investigate whether fruitcake can ever be good. The Poire, Tapee, cherry and dried apricot loaf cake is what we're making today. Now, yeah, cherries, apricots and orange in a lovely little kind of Christmassy looking fruit cake. That's what you're getting. The Poire Tapee is a dried and pressed pear that is apparently a speciality of the Indre-Loire region of France. But guess what? They're impossible to find online when you live in Scotland, and especially in any shops. So instead we opted for just some standard kind of nice sweet dried pears that is Francesco actually left me in the bag to bake with. We began by soaking our dried fruit. We cut up some dried pears, some dried cherries. I actually had to use glacé cherries because as 1970s as they are, it was all I could find, and some dried apricots into some small pieces and macerate these in some liqueur. They opted for Grand Marnier, which is a kind of orange flavoured liqueur, but being me, I had to make things a bit awkward and different, and I used an orange flavoured gin liqueur that I had in the house because am I hell about to spend 20 quid on 2 teaspoons of Grand Marnier. So once these have been soaking for about 10 minutes, we can get going with the rest of the batter. We then cream together some butter and some sugar, adding a whole egg and an egg yolk, whisking it together before adding flour, baking powder and a lovely bit of salt, which they always omit, but I never do. We then add the fruit just to kind of stir it through gently and bake in our lovely prepared loaf tin for about half an hour to 40 minutes. Once finished, we combined some water with some orange juice and some sugar and a little bit of our orange gin liqueur in a pan, boiled it to a syrup and brushed it over our lovely pear, cherry and dried apricot loaf cake. You can see when all that lovely syrup has soaked in, you can see those nice chunks of the fruit in there and the nice fluffy cake around it. The cake itself doesn't have a huge amount of flavour, obviously because it's quite a plain one, but it's lovely and fluffy, lovely and moist, and that fruit definitely brings it up a notch. Nothing like a depressing Christmas fruit cake. It tastes and looks a lot fancier than you'd expect. Folks, I hope you're ready to unleash all hell. This is a passion fruit coconut baba. The baba is a kind of Central and Western European classic. It's very popular in France, very popular in Italy. The thing that makes a baba interesting is the fact this is essentially somewhere between bread and a cake. It's not raised with self-raising flour, with baking powder, with bicarbonate of soda, even with egg whites. It's actually leavened with yeast, just like a good old lovely loaf of bread. And it's definitely a fiddly one. There are 4 different components to this recipe. We have the baba, we have a passion fruit coconut syrup, a passion fruit glaze, and a honey whipped cream. I'll begin by saying I did not make this tiny baba. I barely even had a mold that worked for the biggest one. And Bundt cake molds are so expensive that was I hell gonna buy a new one when I already had a perfectly beautiful one. But I didn't make this tiny one. I just made the big one, so ignore that. We started our baba batter by mixing flour, sugar and salt in a bowl along with a little packet of dried yeast. We then separately mixed together our eggs, some milk and some gin. The recipe wanted rum. It's quite classic in a baba, but again, was I about to go out and pay £14 for a bottle of rum when I had plenty bottles of gin in the cupboard? Sir, I think not. We then mixed our wet ingredients into our dry ingredients and turned this into somewhere between a cake batter and a very wet sourdough looking stuff. We then had to kind of work it by stirring and beating and whisking it until it was smooth and elastic, a bit more like a bread dough than a cake, because you want something between a short crumbliness and a bread-like chewiness to the finished baba. We then transferred our nice kind of worked batter into our baba mold and we let it sit for about an hour in a nice warm place. The book only asked for 45 minutes, but really the longer you can leave a mixture like this to rest and to prove and relax, the better. The more it will grow, the better flavour it will have. Once rested, we baked the baba for 40 minutes as suggested, but as you can see, mine was considerably overbaked after 40 minutes. So foolishly, I should have checked before this. I would definitely say that 30 to 35 minutes would be more than enough. but thankfully we kind of managed to salvage it. The next stage, once our baba was out of the tin, we had to make a passion fruit and coconut syrup. This was made by combining water and sugar in a pan just until it comes to the boil. We then remove it and add coconut milk, passion fruit puree. I just use the kind you can use for cocktails, which is very delicious, and a bit more gin. And we then pour that into a large bowl just to kind of cool down slightly while we get everything else in place. We then basically just had to drown the baba in this syrup. There was far too much syrup here. If you're ever to buy this book, which I always have linked in the description below, and to make this recipe, you could safely half the syrup quantities. Oh my god, I had so much syrup left. After soaking the cake from top and bottom, then leaving it, top and bottom, then leaving it, pouring more over, having excess that I brushed over again, I still had over half of this syrup left. Thankfully, Francesco is very open to a cocktail like I am, and we used any remainders mixed with some water and some more gin as a lovely drink on ice. But otherwise, oh my god, it was far too much syrup. Once the cake had cooled down just a little bit after being sufficiently soaked, we stirred together a little bit of that passion fruit puree with about half a jar of apricot jam. You could also use a proper apricot glaze, but apricot jam is much cheaper and much more available. Once we'd mixed these together, we just brushed them over our slightly still warm cake, just so that it was beautiful, glossy and shiny and really, really inviting looking, even if it was still noticeably overbaked. Following this, we whipped some double cream with just a little bit of honey and a generous pinch of sea salt, seeing as everything else in this recipe was so bloody sweet. And I piped this into the center and kind of cavity of the baba, topping it with some flaked coconut and a little bit more of that passion fruit glaze stuff, and bang, you have a baba. In amongst these bowls and chaos, my makeup-free face and my red cheeks because it's warm. Let's see how it is. So, the texture is like somewhere between a bread roll and a cake. A little bit more burnt on the outside than it should be, but that glaze definitely makes up for it. It's nothing too sweet, even with the drowning of syrup and the glaze on top. Because there was hardly any sugar in the actual mixture before it was baked, it's a lot lighter than you would expect. The booze is pretty much completely gone. That may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing. But on that basis, I'm going to call this tomorrow's breakfast too. I am very, very happy with our baby baba.
We're making a Black Forest Gateau today.
But don't panic, folks, this cake only contains 5 different components, consisting of a Genoese sponge, chocolate flavoured, some imbibing syrup, some chocolate shavings, some chantilly cream, and some cherries. Good gracious. The Black Forest Gateau is an absolute classic, seen in France, seen in Germany, obviously, as it's inspired by the Black Forest in Germany. The recipe begins with our chocolate Genoese. Now, a Genoese is a kind of fatless sponge that's perfect for layered entremet style cakes like this one. It doesn't really taste or feel like many cakes you and I would eat on a regular basis, as it's designed for its stability. It's easy to bend, it's easy to manipulate, it's easy to slice. It doesn't crumble into bits like butter or oil-filled cakes do, but it's also kind of trash to eat on its own, which is why you need to soak it and cover it with cream. We began by beating eggs, some egg yolks and some sugar in a bowl just to combine it, before putting it over a pan of gently simmering water and whisking it for several minutes until it turned pale and thickened and was slightly warm to the touch. This just helps create stability and kind of fluffiness in the cake, as well as cooking the eggs slightly beforehand and dissolving the sugar. We then take the bowl out of this kind of bain-marie heating contraption, mixing it more and more and more until we reach what is known in chefery as the ribbon stage, where you can lift your whisk out of the bowl and the mixture will form a continuous unbreaking ribbon, just to show that there's enough kind of volume in the batter. We then add flour, some kind of starch. They recommended potato starch, but I had cornstarch and some cocoa powder and a little bit of salt, if you're me, into the mixture. I stupidly should have folded this in, but I whisked it in, which I think knocked out a little bit too much air. We then place an adjusted entremet or chef's ring onto a baking tray. Sadly, because I beat most of the air out, it was a little bit too liquid and started to escape, but we quickly baked it and got it semi-salvaged. Folks, it is still only 9 o'clock in the morning, but we have arrived at a truly traumatic point of this recipe. We now have to cut this into 3 layers. My common sense and laziness wants to do 2. Just cut it in half, kind of along the middle, and do it that way. But the book wants 3, so we're gonna do 3. This is gonna be the most lopsided thing I've ever made, eaten, seen. We have one super skinny layer. Holy shit. Okay, so I'm going to cut this second thing in half and then we can start layering and stuff. Now, the book recommended water, sugar, and cherry liqueur, but as I was using a kind of canned cherry filling to make this recipe, I had a lot of liquid cherry juice, cherry syrup stuff left over, so I just diluted that and used that instead, and it did a lovely job of moistening and flavouring the cake. Next, we had to prepare some chantilly cream, which you might remember if you've watched the creme episode of the series. The book recommended preserved cherry, so the kind you might get in a can or a jar. I used this kind of canned cherry pie filling, so it is very sweet, but as the other components of this recipe aren't really, it did kind of carry it. Then you basically repeat. You add the second cake layer, you add your syrup, you add your cream, you add your cherries, repeat until you're at the point where you're basically just using plastering techniques to cover this thing in whipped cream. Then you can top it however you like. The book decided to use 200 grams of milk chocolate to make these fiddly but still not entirely impressive looking chocolate shavings. I just sliced some off of a chocolate bar that I had because it just seemed a better use of everyone's time. Before adding some more cherries and some decorative bits and popping it in the fridge for about an hour before getting my gums round it. My dear, lovely viewers, the Gateau has finished its minimum chilling time. The book recommended at least 1 hour in the fridge to allow everything to set and soak up. It's been 2 hours. I've had some lunch, done some life admin, washed my face, procrastinated, the usual, but I am ready. And the Gateau is ready, so let's go. Girl, I'm gonna be honest, we've deviated from the plan just a little bit in terms of decoration, but I like it. I feel like this is actually more 70s, but you know, I thought I'd put a little kind of swirl on it so that it almost looks like a cake in its own right. Whereas this, I don't know. I know it's an entremet, so it's not supposed to be perfectly neat on the outside, but it's just, part of this was a little sloppy. I know mine's gonna look sloppy on the inside, but I thought I could at least make it look kind of nice on the outside. You can feel how soft that is even just by putting your fork through it. It's everything you want from a Gateau. Wonderfully light. It's all the glory of a cake, but with that kind of more European freshness and lightness to it. There's none of the kind of super sticky, heavy feeling that buttercream can give you on a British or American cake. As much as it looks like it's going to be a kind of dark, almost heavy or super rich dessert, it's so not. It's all the kind of lightness and fluffiness of a trifle almost. it is finally time to taste our opera cake, our Gateau Apricot. You know, it doesn't look like it did in the book for various reasons. I do have some issues with the actual recipe that I'm going to get off my chest before I eat it and then hopefully cheer up from all the chocolate. The main one is just the appearance. I mean, I feel like we should have had, as many other opera cake recipes do have, kind of 3 different layer differentiations. If we had had some of the cream in between these, or even a different kind of ganache, I just really think that would have made it look a lot more elegant and broken it up more nicely. You know, obviously I haven't got scientific precision between each layer, but there's something about the pistachio green next to the really dark chocolate brown that I'm just not a fan of. Another issue in terms of texture that I have with this cake is the fact that while the cream at this temperature, having been in the fridge, is still beautifully soft, fluffy, and creamy, the ratio of the chocolate ganache in this recipe, when it's been in the fridge, you can probably see it's like the inside of a chocolate truffle. It's completely solid, which when you're eating a cake is annoying, but I can't leave this at room temperature because the cream will go off. I have issues with this opera cake, but I'm gonna shut up and taste it now. The cake's not too bad. It's tender. It's got that nice density that Joconde has. I fear the pistachio maybe doesn't hold up to the chocolate enough. But ultimately, you know, it's a combination of delicious things, not in perfect proportion. It feels like an opera cake. It just doesn't quite have the wow and the balance that it should have. But we've successfully made the next recipe in the cake chapter. Shall we move on to the next? I hope you're ready for Christmas in September, because apparently that's the vibe we're bringing today with this lemon Yule log that I refuse to make into a Yule log. It's currently barely even into autumn, and it's pouring with rain, but we're not ready for Christmas content yet. So even though this is a log, ignore that. Agree with all of the far too many components and far too many eggs that are in this recipe, but the kind of festivity, forget it. We're making this into a weird kind of cuboid instead. This recipe comes with so many parts that I actually just completely deleted one with no hesitation or regret. So we begin with a decoration made from French meringue. You essentially just whisk up some egg whites and add a couple of kinds of sugar along with a little bit of lemon zest, and you then just spread this out onto a tray. Spread it nice and flat onto a sheet of greaseproof paper. You could pipe some shapes if you wanted to, but I quite like the kind of shard effect that you can create once this is ready. We then bake this for about an hour, just until it's nice and crisp and dry and meringue-like. We then move on to our lemon cream. We begin by soaking 1 little leaf of gelatin, that's what this looks like if you've never seen that before, in a bowl of cold water for at least 5 minutes. Meantime, you guessed it, more eggs, folks. We whisk together 5 eggs and an egg yolk in a bowl with some sugar. We add some lemon juice and a little bit of lemon zest, and then we add it to a pan, cooking it over kind of a low simmer, and it will seem like it's doing nothing until suddenly it thickens into this creamy custard-like texture. We then remove it from the heat and allow it to cool for about half an hour before transferring it to a bowl and refrigerating for another hour. While this is cooling down, we make our lemon biscuit or lemon Joconde sponge. We began by melting some butter and mixing together, you guessed it, more eggs with sugar and lemon zest until pale and airy, before adding more lemon juice, lemon zest, flour, baking powder, and our melted butter until we had a cake mix. So I filled this dish with our cake mixture and baked it for about half an hour before allowing it to cool, trimming off the edges and eventually cutting it in half, ready to stack. We then whipped up some double cream and folded this into the lemon cream mixture. So we began by putting 1/2 of our kind of trimmed cake onto our serving board because I didn't have a plate long enough. We then had to brush chocolate hazelnut spread over the top. Now, I don't know if they used a kind of fancy French chocolate hazelnut spread. I used Nutella because we needed a little bit of Italia in this recipe, if you ask me, and Nutella was the most affordable kind. I then piped over kind of about a third of the lemon cream mixture and sandwiched it with the second cake before then kind of topping and spreading the rest of the cream all over, breaking our meringue into shards and sticking that all over the place, decorating it and chilling it for about an hour and a half until we had this. The cake again is a little bit dense for my liking, but it was wonderfully moist. The lemon cream is deliciously kind of tart and tangy to go with that chocolate hazelnut spread. And though this was a bit of an unusual flavor combination, chocolate and lemon together was delicious, and I would totally recommend an easier and less eggy version of this recipe. My loves, today we are tackling a cake that has both terrified and intrigued me for about a decade. The Fraisier Cake. First introduced to me through the Great British Bake Off about 10 years ago. This cake is one of those ones that's so simple that there's nowhere to hide, and that's what makes it so scary. We're relying on structural integrity, precision, and patience. 3 things I'm not known for. So wish me luck. The moment of truth has arrived, and I'm terrified because this series hasn't had a great success rate with creme pâtissier or creme mousseline. Let's see how we get on though. Oh no. Oh, could be worse. It's... Can we not just keep the plastic on and just eat it with a fork, like from the top? How is it supposed to support the weight though? I don't understand. Tell me. So as you can see, the sides have utterly caved in. This is 2 hours of chilling, which is double the amount of time they recommended. I do not understand. This has to be frozen, that one in the picture. It just has to be. Because like, it tastes good. Everything was done as it should have been. And look at that presentation. And so there you have the episode on all things cake. Have I learned anything from this chapter? Yes. This one has been probably the longest one in the making, simply because it's had some very involved recipes, and they've mostly been the kind of recipes that have to be shared and eaten immediately, which is incredibly frustrating as someone who only lives with one other person. But I've definitely learned some new skills. I'm definitely more open to trying Genoese and Giconde sponge baking compared to just kind of classic British or American style cake recipes. There's definitely been some flavor combinations in here that I either haven't used in a long time or have never used before that I'm excited to use again. Some of the recipes, admittedly, are far too complicated and far too finicky and fiddly for the result that they produced, but I still had a lot of fun making this one. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget, you can always support the channel on Patreon if you like. The link is always in the description box below. But that is all I have time for in this episode. I appreciate so much each and every one of you watching, and I will see you for the next one.